All right, so one cool thing in lakes that a lot of people don't really seem to understand is that there is current in lakes, often in the form of wind like we have today. And for most of you that are used to fishing rivers, you're used to trout in particular facing into the current and allowing the current to bring them food. And a lake seems daunting because it's a big expanse of water with relatively no current, but there actually is current in the form of wind. And so one thing to keep in mind when you're fishing lakes, if you're targeting a fish, if there's any wind at all, if there's no wind, there's no current, the fish can go wherever they want in a lake. And even with wind, they'll sometimes move around. But as a general rule of thumb, if there's a general wind direction, the fish will often feed into it because it brings them food. So for instance, if I saw a fish rise right out here, instead of covering the rise, I would cast upwind of the fish so that the fish in theory would swim towards my flies. And then after I cover that fish, by making sure I'm upwind of it, I have the best odds of showing my flies to that fish. So keep that in mind when you're fishing lakes, that you can kind of pattern the fish a little. If you see a fish rise or you just see a fish swimming, generally speaking, they're going to lead themselves into the wind to let the slight bit of current the wind creates bring them food, even though they're swimming through it, creating a lot of the movement themselves. All right, another hack when you're flow tubing, obviously these are small boats, they're propelled by these fins. So wind can be a little bit daunting to a lot of anglers, especially when you haven't spent much time in a flow tube. When we rolled up on this lake today, we rolled in by the dam, and that's on the long end of the reservoir where the wind has had a chance to build waves. So when we rolled up, it looked a little daunting to us. We didn't really want to get out in tubes on that end of the lake. But one hack is to just go to the leeward side of the wind and find a little reprieve, find places where it hasn't had a chance to build waves quite as much, or do what we're doing right now, and that is tuck on the inside of a point where we've got a little bit of protection right behind us so that we're not in as much waves. Not that it's terrible out here because it's not on this end of the lake. The other end of the lake's far worse. But even right here is a lot easier to hang. I'm using a lot less energy. I'm having to kick very little just because I have these bushes to my back. I'm just off this point. Where if we're out here in the middle, it's constantly moving us down the lake. So just be aware of that. Think about your situation. If you roll up to a lake and it looks like it's too windy to fish, it probably isn't. You just need to look around and find a better place to access the lake where the wind is going to influence you a lot less. All right, let's take a look at ways in Stillwater to register takes. So the most common way when you're fishing a midge tip or any sinking line techniques is to just have your rod tip down, and as you're retrieving, you'll feel the take. When that happens, for that to happen, you want to have your rod tip at least very close to the water, or even in some sinking line techniques, I like even having my rod tip under the water. But then we're not seeing anything necessarily, we are just feeling the take, and then we're going to strip set to get tight to those fish. When fishing a floating line or a midge tip, if I'm retrieving flies, then I like to watch what's called the swing tip. From the tip of my rod, from it, when the wind's not blowing me around, from it down to the surface of the water, I try and hold it nice and still and watch for it to tighten up. I know when I'm moving the flies, like that's me tightening, that's me, that's me, that's me. Now it's just kind of sagging. If while it's sagging between my strips, if all of a sudden that swing tip goes tight, I know that I've either got a fish grabbing a fly or I'm creeping along the bottom. I've got some sort of contact, some sort of tension on the other end. No tension, just waiting for that swing tip to lift. And if a fish were to grab it, it would lift up and get really tight, and then I can still strip set. So that's another method. All right, another trick when registering strikes, especially with a midge tip or a floating line, is actually just watching the line itself. So one thing you can do is grab the line, and especially down near the end, and give it a kink on purpose so that when a fish eats, that little kink will have a little bit of memory and a little bit of slack, and it'll kind of straighten up and tighten. Or you can just watch the natural memory, the natural curls in the line. It's tough today because we've got a bit too much chop, but in more calm conditions, sometimes really sensitive takes can be easily seen with a floating line or a midge tip by just watching that fly line and watching for it to all of a sudden tighten up, or watching for the little bit of coil and slack in the line to just jump and go tight. So that's another method. Otherwise, like we talked last week, if you are setting the hook on a indicator rig or a dry dropper, you're just registering the takes by watching your indicator or watching your dry go down, in which case you wouldn't need to strip set. Also, you'd just be setting the hook by lifting the rod. But so just as a recap, there's a few ways. One is pulling flies, keeping the rod tip super low. You don't want to have the rod tip way off the water. You won't feel much. You want the rod tip either just barely off the surface or even slightly below the surface. Then just feeling takes. The next is watching the swing tip from the rod tip down to the water, like so. Then you just watch it, because you know when you're imparting action, you know when it should lift and when it should drop. And if it lifts when you're not moving it, then you know you need to set. And the third is just watching that fly line, watching those coils, watching for it to do anything different than what you've applied action-wise. If it starts to tighten up or starts to go sideways, you know you've got a player out there. So set the hook and catch a few more fish.